Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 68 of my game system design series. In this video, I'll investigate the strengths of World War II battalions during the various campaigns, comparing the opposite battalions and how they changed during the war, specifically in this video between 1939 and 1940. Other years will be covered in the following years. While investigating battalion scale rules, I did find it difficult to determine the strengths of opposing battalions, or any battalions. How could I determine the strength of a battalion, considering it was within a higher level formation? Board games provide a simple gut feel value, which was my initial approach, and it does give me a game, I suppose, but I wanted more historical realism. There are two main issues to deal with in order to arrive at a historically valid combat value for a battalion. How to convert real-life men, weapons and equipment into a combat value is problem 1-1, and how do I deal with supporting and attached formations? Starting with the conceptually simpler, but in terms of work much harder question, I decided to determine the combat strength of a formation using a figure gaming rules point system. I decided to use the Corps Commander point system. The main reason why I did this was I had the most experience with this point system. The other point systems I considered were FFT3, which I actually think is probably better in many ways, but I had less expertise and I hadn't extracted that information into a spreadsheet yet. Many other rules had point systems which were highly subjective, so apart from FFT3 and Corps Commander, I generally avoided those particular sets of point systems because it wasn't really what I was looking for. The other reason why I selected Corps Commander was the point system there was based on actual physical attributes, mainly armour, gun and movement. I must admit, FFT3 was also. It was possible to get the actual specs for a tank and convert them into a Corps Commander points value. Once again, you can do the same thing with FFT3. That was what I was looking for. This basic concept was similar to the old SPI CQ values, which SPI used to assist them in determining the strength of their board game counters. This in turn was based on the US military and also the British military back in World War I, what they called the mad minute, or weight of fire that could be projected in a minute. That was used to determine the combat power of a formation. If we look at armour for armoured vehicles, the point system was based on the average frontal armour of the vehicle. This was calculated by taking the lower hull, upper hull and turret armour values, modified for slope, and averaging them out. The result was then divided by 10, and that was our points value for the armour. I have to admit I reversed engineered this conclusion, and it's possible I am wrong. Perhaps the designers of Corps Commander used a subjective system to derive a points value, but I seem to doubt that, considering how it so closely mirrors actual average armour value for a vehicle. However, if my best guess is correct or not, it does fit most of the vehicle specs the original rules provided, so even if it's wrong, it's as close to be correct as to be irrelevant. As a scientist would say, a working hypothesis. Let's look at an example, in this case a Panther D. The turret has an armour thickness of 110 mm at 11 degree, giving us an actual armour thickness of 112 mm. The upper armour has armour thickness of 80 mm at 55 degrees, giving us 129 mm. The lower hull has an armour thickness of 60 mm at 55 degrees, giving us 105 mm. The average is 118 mm, which divided by 10 gives us 11.8 or 12 points. The Corps Commander rule also takes into account spaced armour, with several levels of spaced armour or available, which will affect points value. As the rules support moderns, we are dealing with some armour types not present in World War II, such as composite, active, and many types of spaced armour as well. The next factor to consider is aspect. The rules support 4 aspect values: very high, high, medium, or standard, low, and very low. For example, the Panther A aspect is high. Aspect is based on the height of the vehicle, so a Hetzer is low. The next is the gun or guns. Each gun has up to 2 hard and 1 soft ratings. The first hard rating is for special ammo, such as APCR. The second is for standard ammo, such as APC, BC. The soft rating is based on a HE round effectiveness. The highest value is selected, which is equal to its ability to penetrate armor, or, alternatively, its HE effectiveness. The HE value, if the HE value origin is unknown, and I suppose, we'd have to do something subjective. However, the designers picked one HE round and based everything from that. My gut feeling, it's based on the 75mm Sherman HP round. That is, they assessed a value on the 75mm Sherman HE round, and all other HE shells were basically derived from this particular value. Thus, the Panther D in 1944, which means, it lacks APCR rounds in this particular point in time, has a hard penetration value of 130mm, which means its cost is 13 points for the gun. The same Panther in 1943 with an APCR round would have a value of 210mm, which means its cost would be 21 points. The Panther also has a heat round, which has a lesser value and is, as a result, ignored. The Panther HE value is 7, so it's also ignored for points reasons. Only the highest value is selected. There is also a modifier based on the round's velocity. This only affects AP rounds, thus a heat or a HE round is not really affected by this modifier. A high velocity round gets a bonus and a low velocity round gets a penalty. Now we come to mobility. There are 5 tracked mobility levels or values ranging from very slow to very fast. The Panther is 16T or standard mobility. There are 2 wheeled values, standard motor transport and all-wheel drive. In some rare cases, a rear-wheeled vehicle may be classed as all-wheel, but this is extremely rare. There are other points values for other special features such as infrared, amphibious, open top, and so on. Indirect fire weapon values are based on their indirect fire effectiveness, which is based on its rate of fire and the weight of HE shell, some ratio between the two. Infantry points values are based on their firepower, which could be hard or soft values. In most cases, the soft values are used. But when the Germans started handing out RPGs like candy, then that value exceeded the soft value and is used. Remember, only the highest value is used. Infantry firepower is affected by the weapons mix, so the standard SG-44 gave the Germans a boost. The Russian SMG armed troops get a very high firepower value, but they have a very low range. It should also be noted all infantry is assumed to represent 10 men. It's not trying to calculate the individual values for each soldier, instead it does for groups of 10 soldiers. There are significantly more nuance that I've covered in this particular video, but as you can see, it's a very detailed point system. There is one issue with this type of point system. Motorized infantry add the points value of the vehicle they're being transported in. This could represent up to a third of the entire points value of the infantry. Thus, an 8-point infantry team of 10 men requires a 4-point truck to transport. This is an extreme example, but does show you some potential issues. You could argue that truck-mounted infantry in a mobile situation would be superior to leg infantry simply because they could carry more ammo and weapons. This could also apply in defence. The trucks ensure organic ammo is significantly higher and the infantry as a result is more effective. But I doubt if this argument could explain away such a major points difference. Thus, if using a points-based system, you may need to discount the points value of motorised infantry to give you a better combat effectiveness comparison with leg infantry. The same occurs with tracked vehicles of different speeds. Does the highest speed of a Stuart give it a combat advantage against the lower speed of a Tiger? I suspect you could argue both sides, so I'm ignoring it for the moment. That is, I'm ignoring dealing with the issue for the moment. A point system is giving you the total combined value of a vehicle, gun or section of 10 men, which includes their mobility. Mobility can be reflected in a formation's movement allowance, so building it into the combat value may be an issue which needs to be considered. So far I feel its major impact is for motorised infantry, which we can account for using good old-fashioned gut feel. Figure gaming points value provides a very rough way of ensuring force mixes are balanced, but they can never be perfect. It's best to look at this value several orders of magnitude higher. Thus, dividing any value by 250 gives you a simpler value when you can compare a value of 2 against a value of 3. You clearly know that the 3 is superior to the 2 by an appreciable amount. Now we come to another potential issue. If the element scale of a set of rules is battalion, how do you deal with headquarters support formations? In this case, the German regiment has a support formation which has a combat strength of 1. What do you do with this? It would be unwise to include a separate element to represent this headquarters support unit, so this may need to be merged in with the battalions. As it turns out, the combined strength of the regiment is 8. So a good solution would be to make each infantry battalion a strength of 3. This does give this division a slight advantage, but for game purposes it's best to round up or round down to ensure elements have a similar strength. Alternatively, you could actually have the headquarters element as a separate element if you wish. In some cases, the support formation could be an independent battalion, or be merged in with other battalions. Generally, it's a better idea to not deploy very small 1 SP battalions and merging them into infantry battalions instead. In this case, each infantry battalion would have a strength of 4 to equal the regimental strength of 12. However, as the infantry is motorised, a significant portion of the points are being used for the trucks. I generally feel assuming 1 SP per battalion represents trucks and needs to be removed. Thus, in this case, the 3 infantry battalions remain with a combat strength of 3 each. As you can see, there's a lot of subjective common sense decision that needs to be made by individual designers. The next issue is divisional support formations. In this case, the division only has a battalion strength formation under it, which makes life rather simple. The recon battalion is best represented by a separate element, so in this case there is no issue. The anti-tank battalion is more of an issue. The answer depends on the rules and the game system, but you would either deploy it as a separate element with special anti-tank attributes, or allow it to influence any number of friendly elements in base-to-base contact with it, which represents the battalion distributed throughout those subordinate elements in base-to-base combat. In simple terms, some special rules are required because the anti-tank battalion tends to be an unusual formation designed to do a very specific task. Now we come to a bigger issue, what to do with the engineer battalion. In the world of board games, at this scale, this formation is both ignored or alternatively deployed. If deployed, it has some special attributes, but is otherwise unable to perform the duties of a standard infantry battalion. As engineers consist of non-combat engineers and combat engineers, special rules will be used to reflect its unique abilities. The non-combat engineers build bridges and fortifications, while the combat engineers assist with attacking fortifications. In this example, the division has a divisional support formation. What should you do with this formation? As this is normally small, I would use it to assist with any rounding up elsewhere, and if there was no places for it, then it would be ignored. In some cases, it may be best to round up to a regiment. This would certainly be the case if the battalion strength was 1, but even at a strength of 2, it may be an option. In this case, you could field 3 battalions of 2 strength points, or 1 regiment of 6 strength points. The question is, why would you do this? In this case, the Russian battalion tank strength is low compared with the Germans. So if the Germans are fielding Panther battalions of 8 strength points, it may be better to combine the Russian battalions into a single regiment. This does depend on the game mechanics, and if the rules support something akin to stacking or rear support, there may be no need to deploy regimental sized formations. So in this case, the Russians could deploy a single tank brigade of 11 strength points, which I suspect is too large, or 3 tank battalions of 3 strength points, and 1 motorised infantry battalion of 2 strength points. Note, the headquarter formation is merged in with a motorised battalion, and 1 is subtracted for motorisation in this particular case. The next topic is, what do the points mean and how can they be used? While we can compare infantry with infantry, how do we compare unlike troop types such as armoured, anti-tank artillery engineers and anti-aircraft? The points represent the value of these troops when they operate in their normal environment. Thus, tanks like attacking in wide open terrain, while infantry like defending in difficult terrain. Thus, 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry. Thus, comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions need to be put through a very strong subjective filter. This would typically need to be done in the rules, but one example would be armoured combat strength is used for attacking, and for defending it's a fraction of its total value. The opposite would be the case for infantry. I'll not drill down in any detail here, as it does depend on the rules mechanics, but what I have provided is one example. Megablitz achieves the same, but in a slightly different manner. Anti-tank battalions are a special type of battalion designed to defend against armoured attack. The strength would represent their standard defensive strength against normal attack, but if attacked by armour, it would probably be doubled, or the armoured attack would be halved. Once again, another rules mechanic related issue. Tank destroyers would work in a similar manner, except they could conduct attacks if required. Engineers, apart from engineering functions, would defend using its combat strength, but would not attack in a normal manner. Perhaps when in conjunction with infantry attack, it could assist, especially against fortified locations. Assault gun battalions could also operate in a similar manner, with some advantage when facing infantry in fortified positions. Let's now look at artillery. The combat strength would be used when these formations are defending against a direct attack. The artillery itself would have some other way of projecting its bombardment strength to assist other attacks. In this case, understanding what the battalion represents is important. The 15 centimetre battalion would have a longer range than the 10.5 centimetre battalion. As for the bombardment strength, the values could be identical, or the 15 centimetre may get some benefit due to it having larger shells, although its rate of fire may be less. As a general rule, I'll not be covering artillery in my comparison analysis. Now, let's look at the period 1939 to 1940 to compare the combat strengths of the various battalions of all nationalities which opposed each other. Starting in 1939, the Germans began World War II when they invaded Poland. Let's ignore the Japanese invasion of China. Some people could argue that's probably the beginning, but we'll start with Poland in 1939. After a period of phony war, the Germans first invade Denmark and Norway before moving into France. Let's first look at foot infantry. Quick point about numbers. Because of the rounding when you total the battalions of a regiment, sometimes it does not equal the regimental value. For example, the Russian infantry battalions have a points value of 646 points, which when divided by 250 rounds up to 3. The other point to make is when I will be making my battalion comparison, I'll be including any support formation, so the German battalion will be 3 in this case. For those who do not like this rounding, the raw battalion values are included as well. Let's first look at the Russians, which possesses a battalion strength of 3. The value for the Russians and Belgium only differs by a small amount. However, the Russian value is rounded up and the Belgium number is rounded down. Regardless, the regimental value gives us a more accurate view, and it's true. The Russian infantry regiments were more powerful than any of these other nations. Their quality, on the other hand, was very low, but assuming equal quality, they were very powerful indeed. When we look at Poland, the story is reasonably clear. The Polish battalions were smaller than most other nations. Their quality may have been very high, but in terms of raw combat power, they were smaller. I suspect in a set of rules, the Polish infantry would be deployed as regiments rather than battalions. For the other nations, the values are all reasonably close. I was actually rather surprised at this, but while the German battalions had more firepower, the French had a higher density of infantry support weapons. The Belgian battalions were the real surprise to me. Let's now look at motorised troops, which were not part of an armoured division or brigade. The first point is the combat strengths of all the battalions should be reduced by 1 if you wish to really compare them against foot infantry battalions. This is due to the points cost of the motor transport. Just a quick note, if the scale of your rules are, battalion, you could argue that the points cost for the transport should be included. But anyway, let's put that to one side. Looking at the Polish, which lacked a motorised division, we have the motorised battalion from the cavalry brigade and the motorised regiment from the mechanised brigade. The Polish battalions were smaller than most of the other nationalities shown here. The Russian motorised brigade was rather large and was actually a mechanised formation rather than the pure motorised formation. The value of 3, which drops to 2, is the same as leg infantry, which is reasonable. Once we allocate support formations, this would probably go back up to 3. The French and Belgian battalion level formations are similar. However, the French have more support assets and their battalions would end up being 3 each, while the Belgian battalions would probably drop down to 2. The German, Italian and British motorised battalions look rather similar and would all have a strength of 3 once we remove the 1 for being motorised. I was a bit surprised by the Italians, although their regiments only have 2 battalions, so at a regimental strength they were not as strong as these other 2 nationalities. Let's now look at motorised, mechanised or armoured infantry in the armoured divisions or brigades. When a battalion is mechanised, it's equipped with armoured personnel carriers, which would be very useful in combat. Thus, these would not be reduced by 1 SP for being mobile. The largest infantry formation in an armoured formation of the Polish, British and Russian was the battalion. For the British, this was the case in their armoured division. For the others, this was the case in their brigades. The Italians were a surprise to me, as their motorised battalions are very weak. This would be best fielded as a regiment, with 1 subtracted for probably being motorised because they're not mechanised. The French had a number of different armoured divisions. This shows the infantry regiments in 3 of them. The first is their cavalry division, which was rather small and with reasonably weak battalions, 2 SPs per battalion. The next was their mechanised divisions, or DLM divisions. This had powerful half-tracked and fully tracked mounted infantry battalions and 1 track-mounted battalion. The last was from the 7th DLM, and it had an extra motorised infantry battalion in it. Finally, we come to the Germans, which possessed powerful motorised battalions. In summary, we can see the pure motorised battalions ranging from 1 to 3, as we saw earlier, and mechanised battalions of 2 or 3 and 4 SPs. The mechanised battalions were unique to the French in 1939-40, and they were very powerful. Now we come to the juicy part, the armour or tank formations. The Russians lacked a pure tank regiment, but if we look at their brigades, the tank battalions were not really very powerful. The Polish were even in a worse position, lacking any tank formation larger than the battalion. The battalions were reasonable, although there were not many of them. The French possessed many different armoured regimental formations. The battalion generally ranged from a strength of 2 to 3. While the heavy tanks were powerful, their numbers were low in each battalion, and there was a lack of supporting formations, so they averaged out the same as German tank battalions. When we look at the Germans, their battalions were similar in strength to the French, Polish and Russians. The Italians are a bit interesting as well. The regiment contained a truly huge number of tankettes. While tankettes may not be much good against other armour, they could be very effective against infantry, especially in 1939 with a lack of anti-tank weapons. And the main job of tanks was to run down infantry, so this gave them a reasonable amount of effectiveness. Saying that, it does look rather powerful, and I suspect the point system may be a bit too generous to the humble tankette. On the other hand, the Panzerkampfwagen 1 was little better than the tankette, so perhaps the point system is correct. The real surprise to me was the British, who possessed reasonably large armoured battalions equipped with reasonably powerful tanks. While you could argue the German Panzerkampfwagen 4 was better than many British tanks, their numbers were low and diluted by Panzerkampfwagen 1s and 2s. In summary, we can see tank battalion strengths ranging from 2, 3 and 5. The strength 2 battalions were also made up of armoured cars and could be better placed in an armoured car category, but most tank battalions had a strength of 3. I was surprised how similar the battalions were in terms of strength. A set of rules would only require 3 types of leg infantry, motorised infantry and tank battalions, each to allow you to field the forces that were fielded historically. In some edge cases you need to field regimental-sized formations, but these would be rather minimal. This shows a summary of the values by nationalities. The one point which did surprise me was how the tank battalions did not differ based on the type of tank. Light tank battalions normally contained more tanks, thus were as strong as the medium tank battalions. On the other hand, the heavy tank battalions contained less tanks, and were as a result the same strength as the medium tank battalions. The formations I've not covered are the reconnaissance battalions. These come in different flavours: foot, cycle, horse, truck, tracked, armoured car and tank. Due to the complexity, I've left these out of this video. This video is already too long. However, for those interested, this shows the various reconnaissance battalions from the main combatants, both from their infantry and armoured divisions. And so we come to an end of episode 68 of my video on game system design. In this case, analysing the strength of World War II battalions during the period 1939 to 1940. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.